At 2 o'clock in the morning on a rainy night in October 1944, 12 American soldiers learned the most expensive lesson in warfare. Silence is not free. It costs lives. These men were creeping through a forest near Aachen, Germany, moving like ghosts through the darkness, their boots finding purchase on wet leaves without sound. They were professionals. Most had survived Normandy. They understood how to disappear into shadows. And then a German sentry stepped out to light a cigarette. The American scout had no choice. He raised his Thompson submachine gun and pulled the trigger. In that single moment, 3 Americans died. 5 more were wounded. The mission failed. Not because these soldiers were incompetent, not because the plan was flawed, but because their weapons were too loud. Among the wounded was a 22-year-old kid from Kansas named Tommy Sullivan, who took a bullet through the shoulder while trying to drag a buddy to cover. The man who carried Tommy out of that forest was Sergeant Jack Monroe, a 30-year-old motor pool mechanic from Charleston, West Virginia. A man who had made a promise to Tommy's mother that he would bring her boy home alive. What Jack Monroe built in response to that night would change warfare forever. A weapon made from garbage, an oil filter from a truck, a piece of scrap that military engineers said was impossible. That same piece of trash would later take a bridge without waking a single guard, save an entire armored division, and influence suppressor technology for the next 80 years. But first you need to understand why a mechanic was willing to risk everything, including court-martial and prison, for a promise he made to a widow back home. The autumn of 1944 was supposed to be the beginning of the end. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. Paris was liberated. The German army was retreating. Victory seemed inevitable. But here is what the history books often forget to mention. The closer you get to winning a war, the more desperate the fighting becomes. The Germans knew they were losing. And losing armies do not surrender quietly. They fight harder. They set traps. They rig bridges with explosives. They turn every river crossing into a potential massacre. The problem facing American commanders in October 1944 was brutally simple. They needed bridges. The 3rd Armored Division was advancing through Germany at a pace that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. But tanks cannot swim. Half-tracks cannot float. An entire armored column stops dead when it reaches a river with no bridge. The Germans understood this perfectly. Their strategy was equally simple. Destroy every bridge before the Americans can capture it. Rig the ones you cannot destroy with explosives. Station demolition teams with orders to blow them at the first sign of American forces. It was working. In the first 3 weeks of October 1944, American forces lost 17 bridges to German demolition teams. Each destroyed bridge meant delays. Delays meant the Germans had time to regroup, time to dig in, time to prepare defensive positions that would cost American lives to overcome. But here was the real problem. The problem that was getting men killed in forests and fields across Germany. You cannot capture a bridge by attacking it directly. The moment German defenders see American tanks or hear American artillery, they push the detonator. Bridge gone. Mission failed. The only way to take a bridge intact is to take it quietly. Send a small team in the middle of the night. Eliminate the guards without making noise. Cut the demolition wires before the Germans realize what is happening. In theory, this sounds reasonable. In practice, it was suicide. The standard military solution was knife attacks. Creep up behind a sentry. Slit his throat before he can scream. It sounds simple. Hollywood makes it look easy. But sentries do not stand still with their backs turned. They move. They turn around. They are nervous and alert. One shout brings 50 men with machine guns. The failed patrol in that German forest proved what every soldier already knew. Knife attacks against alert guards almost never work. And when they fail, the noise of a single gunshot announces your presence to every enemy within 2 miles. 3 Americans died in that forest because a Thompson submachine gun was designed to kill, not to kill quietly. But everything was about to change because of one man that nobody was paying attention to. Jack Monroe was not a soldier by nature. He was a mechanic, the son of a mechanic, the grandson of a mechanic. His father, Robert, had built a small garage in Charleston, West Virginia, fixing trucks and tractors with hands that could feel problems an engine was having just by touch. Robert Monroe taught his son everything: how to read an engine by the sound it made, how to fix what was broken with whatever materials you had on hand, how to never give up on a problem just because the solution was not obvious. In 1938, Robert Monroe went to work a shift in the coal mines. He still took occasional underground work when money was tight. It was supposed to be easy. One shift, 8 hours. Come home. He did not come home. The ventilation system failed in the number 7 shaft. The company had been cutting costs, ignoring complaints, putting off maintenance. Methane built up in the deep tunnels. One spark from a pickaxe was all it took. The explosion killed 17 men, including Robert Monroe and Tommy Sullivan's father. Jack was 24 years old when he buried his father. He inherited the garage and a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Bad equipment gets men killed. Good equipment saves lives. And if the people in charge will not provide good equipment, then someone else has to build it. When Pearl Harbor happened, Jack enlisted, bringing along his neighbor, Tommy Sullivan, whose mother Margaret was a widow from that same mine collapse. Mrs. Sullivan grabbed Jack's hand before they left. Her voice was steady despite the tears in her eyes. She said just 7 words that would haunt Jack for the next 3 years. "Jack Monroe, you bring my boy home." Jack looked at Tommy standing there with a dumb grin on his face. Just 20 years old, still a kid in all the ways that mattered. And Jack made a promise he was not sure he could keep. "I promise, ma'am. On my father's grave, I will bring Tommy home." That promise had seemed easy in the sunshine of a West Virginia summer. It seemed a lot harder in a German forest, with Tommy bleeding out in his arms. The idea came to Jack 3 days after the failed patrol. He was underneath a truck up to his elbows in oil and grime when he looked at the oil filter mounted on the engine block. It was a simple device, just a cylindrical metal can filled with mesh baffles and cotton waste, designed to trap sludge from the engine oil. But Jack saw something else. An engine works by creating controlled explosions. Fuel burns. Gas expands rapidly. When that gas exits through the exhaust pipe all at once, it creates a shock wave. That is the noise. A muffler works by trapping that gas in a series of chambers, letting it cool and expand slowly. Baffles inside the muffler break up the pressure wave, turn the explosion into a whisper. A gun works the exact same way. Gunpowder burns behind the bullet. Rapidly expanding gas drives the bullet down the barrel. When that gas hits the open air at the muzzle, it creates a shock wave. That is the bang, the muzzle blast. Jack stared at that oil filter and thought something that would change everything. If it works for a truck engine, why not for a rifle? He crawled out from under the chassis, went to the scrap pile behind the maintenance tent. Every motor pool has one, a mountain of broken parts, worn-out components, things too damaged to fix but too useful to throw away completely. Jack found a used oil filter from a 2.5-ton truck, heavy, black, smelling like burnt carbon and old engine oil. He spent the next 4 hours carefully cutting threads into the barrel of an M3 grease gun, welding a threaded washer to the back of the filter. When he was done, he had created something that looked absolutely ridiculous. The oil filter screwed onto the end of the gun barrel, adding 10 inches of length and 2 pounds of weight. It made the grease gun front heavy and awkward. The filter completely blocked the iron sights. To aim, you would have to point it like a fire hose and hope for the best. But Jack did not care what it looked like. He cared if it worked. The next morning, Jack took the modified grease gun to an improvised firing range behind the motor pool. He should have known better than to hope for privacy. Word travels fast in an army. By the time Jack reached the range, a dozen men had gathered, officers and enlisted, all looking at the contraption in Jack's hands with expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt. Lieutenant Morrison was there, the ordnance officer, a West Point graduate who believed in regulations and procedure and the inherent superiority of equipment designed by trained engineers. He looked at Jack's homemade silencer and actually laughed. "Sergeant Monroe, is that an oil filter welded to a submachine gun?" "Yes, sir." "And you think this will work?" "Only one way to find out, sir." Morrison's voice dripped with condescension. "You are going to blow your own hand off. The bullets will hit the inside of that canister and the whole thing will explode like a grenade." Jack ignored them. He walked to position, raised the modified grease gun, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The oil filter ruptured. The welds failed under pressure. The canister split along one side with a sharp metallic crack. The shot was deafening, as loud as any unsilenced weapon. The officers erupted in laughter. Morrison was actually holding his sides. "I told you it would explode, Sergeant. You are lucky you still have a hand." But Jack was not thinking about the laughter. He was thinking about the 3 seconds before the filter failed. Because in those 3 seconds, something had happened. The gun had fired. The bolt had cycled. And for just an instant before the welds gave way, he had felt the filter absorb some of the blast. Not all of it, not enough, but some. Which meant it almost worked. Jack spent the next 3 nights redesigning the silencer in secret. Reinforced welds, tighter cotton packing, secured mesh baffles with through bolts. When he tested it at dawn alone, the result was everything he had hoped for. Instead of the sharp ear-splitting crack of a normal gunshot, Jack heard a heavy pneumatic cough, a mechanical thud followed by a sharp hiss of escaping gas. It sounded like a book falling on a carpet. He fired a 10-round burst. The filter got hot. Smoke rose from the vents. But the welds held. The baffles held. The gun cycled smoothly. It worked. A mechanic from West Virginia, using garbage from a scrap pile and skills learned in his father's garage, had just built a functional suppressor for a submachine gun. But when Jack demonstrated it for Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer, the response was not what he expected. "Sergeant, this is remarkable work. But I cannot authorize its use. This device violates regulations on weapon modifications. It has not been tested by ordnance. I will not risk men being injured by untested equipment. Sir, with respect, men are already being injured. 3 died last week because we were too loud. That is enough, Sergeant. Remove the device. This discussion is over." Jack stood at attention. Every muscle in his body wanted to argue, but you do not disobey a direct order. The silencer was banned. The promise to Margaret Sullivan seemed further away than ever. But 2 days later, orders came through for a mission that would change everything. A bridge, 15 miles away, rigged with explosives, the only crossing in the sector, and the plan to capture it called for knife attacks against alert German guards. Jack looked at Tommy Sullivan and made a decision. Regulations be damned. He was not going to watch his best friend die because loud guns were all the army would allow. What happened next on that bridge in the darkness of October 1944 would prove that sometimes the right tool is the one they tell you not to use. But that story, the story of how 12 Americans took a bridge without waking the guards, how a piece of garbage saved an armored division, how Jack Monroe kept his promise, that story continues in Part 2. In Part 1, you met Jack Monroe, a mechanic from West Virginia who built a suppressor from an oil filter after watching 3 Americans die because their weapons were too loud. You saw him test his invention. You watched officers laugh when his first prototype failed. And you witnessed the moment when his redesigned silencer actually worked. But Colonel Harrison banned it. Regulations, procedures, untested equipment. The bridge mission was coming. 12 men would go in with knives against German guards armed with machine guns. And Jack Monroe had just been ordered to dismantle the only tool that could save them. Here is a statistic that should make you angry. In October 1944, the American military had over 200 different weapon variants in active use across the European theater. Rifles, submachine guns, pistols, machine guns, mortars. Not a single one of them was designed to be quiet. Zero. Meanwhile, German demolition teams were blowing bridges faster than American forces could capture them. 17 bridges destroyed in 3 weeks, each one costing days of delay. Each delay costing lives. The technology to prevent this existed. It was sitting in Jack Monroe's footlocker wrapped in an oily rag, and the United States Army had just forbidden its use. This is when everything got worse. Colonel Richard Harrison was not a bad man. He was a career officer who had spent 20 years learning one fundamental truth about military operations. Unauthorized equipment gets soldiers killed. He had seen it happen in North Africa. A sergeant had modified a jeep with extra armor plating, looked impressive, made the crew feel safe, until the added weight caused the axle to snap during a firefight. 3 men died because someone thought they knew better than the engineers. Harrison carried that memory like a scar. When he looked at Jack Monroe's oil filter silencer, he did not see innovation. He saw a potential disaster waiting to happen. What if the filter explodes after 30 rounds instead of 50? What if a soldier relies on it and it fails at the critical moment? What if shrapnel from a ruptured canister blinds someone? These were not unreasonable concerns. They were the concerns of a man responsible for the lives of thousands of soldiers, but they were also the concerns of a man who could not see past his own experience. The morning after Jack's successful demonstration, Harrison called him into the command tent. The colonel sat behind a field desk covered with maps and reports. His face showed the exhaustion of a man who had not slept properly in weeks. Sergeant Monroe. I understand you still have that device? Sir, Do you still have it? Yes, sir. Harrison's voice was quiet but firm. You were given a direct order to remove the modification from your weapon and return it to standard configuration. Did you do that? Jack hesitated. The truth was that he had removed the filter from the grease gun, but he had not destroyed it. It sat in his footlocker, waiting. I removed it from the weapon, sir. But you kept it. Yes, sir. Why? Because 3 men died last week. Because Tommy Sullivan almost bled out in my arms. Because in 48 hours we are sending 12 men to take a bridge with knives, and I have something that could save their lives. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studied Jack for a long moment. Monroe, do you know what happens to sergeants who disobey direct orders in a combat zone? Jack knew. Court-martial, prison, dishonorable discharge. Everything he had worked for gone. Everything he had promised Sarah about coming home erased. Yes, sir. I know. Then why are you still talking to me about that filter? Because my father died because a company cut corners on equipment. Because I promised Tommy's mother I would bring him home. Because being right matters more than being safe. The room was silent. Harrison's jaw tightened. Finally he spoke. Get out of my tent, Sergeant. And if I hear one more word about that device, you will spend the rest of this war in a stockade. Jack saluted, turned to leave. And that should have been the end of it. But someone else had been listening. Staff Sergeant Mike Dawson was standing outside the command tent when Jack emerged. Big Mike was 35 years old, Chicago cop before the war. He had seen enough violence to know the difference between regulations and reality. He was also the man assigned to lead the bridge assault. Monroe, wait up. Jack stopped. Big Mike walked over. His voice was low. I heard what you said in there. About the filter. You really think it works? It works. I tested it myself. 50 rounds before the packing burns out. But that is 50 quiet rounds. Enough to take a bridge. Big Mike was silent for a moment. 3 of my guys died on that patrol last week. Martinez had a wife and 2 kids. Jensen was 19 years old. Williams was going to propose to his girl when he got home. Jack nodded. He knew. Everyone knew. Tomorrow Harrison is going to brief us on the bridge mission. Big Mike's voice was hard. His plan is knives. Sneak up behind the sentries, slit throats, Hope nobody screams. You know what the odds are on that working, Jack knew. Maybe 10%, maybe less. Knife attacks against alert guards almost never succeeded. One mistake, one sound, one sentry who turns around at the wrong moment, and 12 Americans die on a German bridge while tanks wait helplessly on the other side. Here is what is going to happen. Big Mike leaned closer. I am in command of that mission. What I bring with me is my decision. Tomorrow night when we cross that bridge, you are going to be carrying that filter. And if it works, Harrison will never know. And if it fails, then we are all dead anyway. What difference does it make? Jack looked at Big Mike, saw the same anger he felt, the same frustration with rules that made no sense, the same determination to bring men home alive. You could get court-martialed for this. So could you. Big Mike almost smiled. But my guys will be alive to testify against me. That is good enough. They shook hands. The deal was made. In 24 hours, Jack Monroe would either prove that garage trash could save lives, or die trying to prove it. The night of October 23, 1944 was cold and wet. Perfect conditions for what 12 Americans were about to attempt. Rain drummed on the canvas of the assembly tent, where Big Mike briefed his squad. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Cross the Rower River at 0100 hours. Low crawl across the bridge supports. Eliminate the sentries. Storm the bunker. Cut the demolition wires. Signal success with a green flare. Main armored column crosses at 0330. Time was critical. If the green flare did not go up by 0300, the tanks would advance anyway, which meant anyone still on the bridge would be caught between American armor and German defensive positions. The official equipment list included knives, pistols for emergency use only, grenades, wire cutters, standard issue gear for a silent infiltration mission. What the official list did not include was a grease gun with an oil filter screwed to the barrel. Jack carried it wrapped in a tarp, hidden under his pack. Tommy Sullivan saw it, said nothing, just nodded. The squad moved out at 100. 12 men ghosting through German-occupied territory. 3 miles of forest and farmland to reach the river. Jack moved in the middle of the column. The modified grease gun felt heavier than usual. The filter pulled the barrel down. His arms ached from holding it up, but he did not complain. He was thinking about the promise he had made to Margaret Sullivan, about the letter from Sarah sitting in his breast pocket, about the baby daughter he had never met waiting for him in West Virginia. They reached the river at 0145. The bridge materialized out of the darkness. Black steel girders spanning black water. 200 feet long, high enough for the river to flow underneath, and rigged with enough explosives to drop the entire structure into the water. Jack could see the demolition charges. Boxes strapped to the support pylons. Wires running up to the roadway. One spark. One electrical current. One German with his hand on a detonator. That was all it would take. On the near end of the bridge, a single sentry paced back and forth. Young kid, maybe 20, carrying a rifle, wearing a rubber raincoat that glistened in the darkness. Big Mike crawled up beside Jack, whispered directly into his ear. Sentry is not following a pattern, cannot predict when his back will be turned. The knife plan would never work, not against this guard, not in these conditions. Jack unwrapped the grease gun. Rain hit the hot metal. He wiped water off the filter, checked the action. Bolt slid smooth. Magazine seated. 30 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition. He only needed one. The sentry stopped pacing, reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He was going to light up, hands busy with a match, head down. Maybe 10 seconds where he would not be looking around. Jack took position, prone in the mud, elbows braced. He could not use the sights because the filter blocked them. He had to aim by instinct. Point the barrel, trust his eye, pray the bullet went where he wanted. The German struck a match. Orange flare in the darkness, face illuminated. Young, tired, scared. Jack settled the wire stock against his shoulder, focused on the center of the German's raincoat. Took a breath. let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The grease gun fired, heavy bolt slamming forward, sharp exhale of trapped gas. The sound was wrong. Not a gunshot, a mechanical thud followed by a high-pressure hiss, like a pneumatic drill punching through sheet metal. 40 yards away, the German sentry felt a sledgehammer hit him in the chest. He dropped the cigarette, dropped the match, folded in half, collapsed onto the wet pavement without making a sound, dead before he hit the ground. Jack waited for the alarm, for shouts, for muzzle flashes, for Germans pouring out of the bunker. Nothing. Just rain on steel and the rush of water below. Big Mike stared at the dead sentry, then at Jack, then at the oil filter smoking in the rain. His mouth was hanging open. Holy Christ! It worked. The next 45 minutes were the longest of Jack Monroe's life. The squad moved across the bridge, fast and low. Jack led with the smoking grease gun. Halfway across, they found the machine gun nest. 2 Germans sitting behind an MG-42, talking in low voices. Intel had said it would be empty at night. Intel was wrong. Jack took them both. 2 shots, 2 kills. The filter was burning hot now, paint blistering off. But it held. They reached the bunker, stone structure built into the bridge abutment. Yellow light spilling from a slightly open door. A German officer sat inside writing in a logbook. Jack did not hesitate. 1 shot. The officer fell forward onto his desk, coffee cup tipped over. Dark stains spreading across the map of the bridge. Big Mike smashed the detonator, ripped out the telephone wires. The bridge was safe. But headlights were coming from the German side. A supply truck. Maybe a relief shift for the sentries. If the driver saw the dead guards, he would sound the alarm. Jack took position in a ditch. The truck came around the curve. He fired through the windshield. The driver slumped. The truck swerved into a drainage ditch. The passenger stumbled out, dazed, reaching for his rifle. Jack fired again. The filter made a louder noise this time. The packing was failing, but it was still quiet enough. 2 more Germans dead. 6 kills total. 0 alarms raised. At 03:15, Jack felt a vibration in the ground. The rumble of tank engines, the squeal of tracks on pavement. The 3rd Armored Division was coming, and the bridge stood intact. Colonel Harrison climbed out of the lead Sherman, saw the dead sentries, saw the smashed detonator, saw Jack Monroe holding a grease gun with a burned and warped oil filter screwed to the barrel. How the hell did you take this bridge without waking the bunker? Jack held up the ruined filter. Still hot, still smoking. A piece of garbage that had saved 12 Americans and an entire armored division. We had a little help from the motor pool, sir. Harrison was silent for a long moment. Then he handed the filter back. Get yourself a new one, Sergeant. We have more bridges to cross. That single night changed everything. 60 miles of advance in 3 weeks. German defensive lines collapsing because bridges that should have been destroyed stood intact. Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. Mechanics across the European theater started experimenting with oil filters and welding torches. Some succeeded. Some failed. One private lost 2 fingers when a poorly welded canister ruptured. Command issued stern memos about unauthorized modifications. But they also started asking questions. By November 1944, ordnance officers were filing reports about suppressed weapons, recommending research, suggesting that special operations units might benefit from silenced firearms. They did not credit Jack Monroe, did not mention the Rower River Bridge. But the idea was out there now, in official channels, being discussed by people who made decisions. Tommy Sullivan was evacuated 3 days later. Leg wound from the final firefight, minor but enough for a medical discharge. He was going home, back to Kansas. Back to his mother, who would cry when she saw him alive. Jack had kept his promise, but as the 3rd Armored Division pushed deeper into Germany, reports started coming in from other sectors. Reports that made commanders nervous. The Germans had noticed something strange. American patrols that moved without sound. Sentries dying without gunshots. Bridges captured before demolition teams could react. Enemy intelligence was asking questions. And somewhere in Berlin, someone was trying to figure out how to stop what Jack Monroe had started. The real war was just beginning. In Part 1, you met Jack Monroe, a mechanic who built a suppressor from an oil filter after watching 3 Americans die because their weapons were too loud. In Part 2, you watched him defy direct orders, carry that banned device onto a bridge rigged with explosives, and take out 6 German guards without waking a single soul. The 3rd Armored Division crossed that bridge. 60 miles of advance followed. Word spread through the ranks. Mechanics across Europe started experimenting with oil filters and welding torches. But something else was spreading too. Reports. Intelligence. Questions being asked in Berlin about American patrols that moved without sound. About sentries dying without gunshots. About bridges captured before demolition teams could react. By November 1944, German intelligence had identified 17 incidents where American forces achieved objectives that should have been impossible without suppressed weapons. They did not know how. They did not know who. But they knew something had changed, and they were determined to stop it. This was no longer an experiment. This was war. The first German response came on November 12, 1944. A memo circulated through Wehrmacht command channels marked urgent. American forces in the Aachen sector have demonstrated capability for silent elimination of sentries at ranges up to 50 meters. Source unknown. Method unknown. Countermeasures required immediately. The memo reached Field Marshal Walter Model's headquarters within hours. Model was not a man who panicked easily. He had earned the nickname the Führer's Fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts. But this report troubled him. Silent weapons meant silent infiltration. Silent infiltration meant bridges captured intact. Bridges captured intact meant American armor could advance without delay. And American armor advancing without delay meant the war would end sooner. Model ordered an immediate review of all defensive positions along the Western Front. The results were alarming. In the 6 weeks since October 1st, German forces had lost 23 bridges to American assault teams. Before October, the loss rate had been approximately 1 bridge per week. After October, it jumped to nearly 4 per week. Something had changed. Model's intelligence officers proposed several theories. American commandos with specialized training, new weapons supplied by British Special Operations, Soviet technology shared through intelligence channels. None of them guessed that the answer was a mechanic from West Virginia with a welding torch and an oil filter. But they did not need to know the source to develop countermeasures. On November 15th, Model issued new orders. All bridge garrisons would be doubled. Sentries would patrol in pairs, never alone. Guard rotations would be randomized. Tripwires and flares would be installed on all approaches. And most importantly, demolition teams would be authorized to destroy bridges at the first sign of anything unusual. Not confirmed enemy contact. Anything unusual. A shadow moving wrong. A sound that did not fit. A sentry who failed to respond to a challenge. One hint of American presence, and the bridge would go down. These countermeasures made Jack Monroe's job infinitely harder. But they also proved something important. The Germans were scared. They were reacting to a threat they did not understand. And reactive armies make mistakes. But the Germans were not the only problem Jack Monroe faced. The success of the Roer River Bridge created unexpected complications. Word spread fast in an army. Too fast. By the end of November, at least 40 different motor pools across the European theater had attempted to build oil filter suppressors. Most failed. The physics were simple. The execution was not. Wrong filter types, poor welding technique, incorrect threading, insufficient reinforcement. Filters that looked functional but ruptured after 10 rounds instead of 50. On November 22nd, a private in the 1st Infantry Division lost 2 fingers when a poorly constructed filter exploded during testing. 3 days later, a sergeant in the 9th Army suffered burns to his face and hands when his homemade suppressor failed catastrophically. Command had no choice. On November 28th, General Omar Bradley issued a theater-wide prohibition on unauthorized weapon modifications. The order was clear. Any soldier found in possession of a modified weapon would face immediate court-martial. No exceptions. No appeals. The technology Jack Monroe had pioneered was now officially forbidden. Again. But the order created a paradox. The suppressors worked. Everyone knew they worked. The Rower River Bridge proved they worked. 23 captured bridges proved they worked. German countermeasures proved they worked. And yet soldiers were being threatened with prison for trying to use them. Colonel Harrison called Jack into his tent the day the order came down. "Monroe, you started something I cannot stop. Sir, mechanics are building these things everywhere. Most of them are doing it wrong. Men are getting hurt." Harrison's voice was tired. "I need you to fix this. How, sir, I do not know. But you built the first one that worked. You understand the engineering. Figure out a way to make them safe, or figure out a way to stop men from trying." Jack understood the impossible position. He could not train every mechanic in the European theater. He could not inspect every improvised suppressor. And he could not stop soldiers from trying to build something that might save their lives. But he could do something else. Something that would require breaking regulations one more time. December 3, 1944. A farmhouse 12 miles behind the front lines. Jack Monroe stood in front of 32 men. Mechanics, armorers, a few infantry sergeants who had heard rumors about the Rower River Bridge. They had gathered in secret, without orders, without authorization, to learn how to build something the Army had just banned. Jack held up an oil filter. Standard truck component, available in every motor pool. The key is reinforcement. He pointed to the seams. Single-pass welds will fail. You need 3 passes minimum. Build up layers of metal until the seams are twice as thick as the original design. He showed them the threading technique, the internal bolt placement, the cotton packing density, how to test a filter before trusting your life to it. He explained the failure modes, what happened when baffles came loose, why some filters ruptured and others held, the difference between a functional suppressor and a pipe bomb. By the end of the session, 32 men understood the engineering. They would return to their units, train others. The knowledge would spread through informal channels, unofficial, unauthorized, but effective. Jack did not keep records of these sessions. Neither did anyone who attended. As far as official Army history was concerned, they never happened. But by Christmas 1944, an estimated 200 functional oil filter suppressors were in use across the Western Front. Most were never recorded. Most were destroyed after use, but they existed, and they worked. And because a mechanic refused to let regulations cost more lives. January 15, 1945. The Ardennes Forest. The Battle of the Bulge had been raging for a month. German forces had launched a massive counteroffensive through the weakest section of Allied lines. American units were scattered. Communication was disrupted. Supply lines were cut. In the chaos, a German armored column had captured a critical crossroads near the town of Houffalize. The crossroads controlled access to 3 major roads. As long as the Germans held it, American reinforcements could not reach isolated units to the north. 1,700 American soldiers were trapped behind enemy lines, running low on ammunition, running low on food, running out of time. The problem was the crossroads itself. The Germans had fortified it heavily. 2 machine gun nests, a mortar position, an anti-tank gun covering the main approach, and at least 40 infantry dug into the surrounding buildings. A direct assault would be suicide. American commanders estimated it would cost at least 200 casualties to take the position conventionally. They did not have 200 men to spare. Staff Sergeant Mike Dawson received the mission briefing at 1400 hours. Infiltrate the German position after dark. Eliminate the machine gun crews. Disable the anti-tank gun. Create confusion that would allow the main assault force to advance. Standard infiltration tactics. Knives and grenades. Except Big Mike knew those tactics did not work anymore. The Germans had adapted. Paired sentries, random patrols, tripwires. Everything Model had ordered after the bridge incidents. He found Jack Monroe in the motor pool, working on a Jeep engine, pretending not to notice the grease gun with the oil filter screwed to the barrel, sitting under a tarp in the corner. "Monroe, I need that thing." Jack looked up. "Crossroads." Big Mike nodded. 40+ Germans, 2 machine guns. "We go in loud. We all die." Jack wiped his hands, reached under the tarp, handed Big Mike the grease gun. "I rebuilt it last week. Fresh filter, fresh packing. Should be good for 60 rounds. Take care of it." The assault team moved out at 2200 hours. 12 men, same number as the Rower River Bridge, different objective. Higher stakes. The temperature was 8 degrees below zero. Snow covered everything. Their white camouflage made them ghosts against the frozen landscape. Big Mike led with the suppressed grease gun. They approached from the east, through a frozen streambed that the Germans had not bothered to fortify. Ice cracked under their boots. The sound seemed deafening in the silence. But the Germans did not hear. They were focused on the main road, expecting an attack from the west. The first sentry was standing behind a ruined wall, smoking a cigarette. His partner had gone inside to warm up, against orders. But it was cold, painfully cold. Nobody wanted to stand in the snow longer than necessary. Big Mike raised the grease gun. 40 yards, no sights, just instinct. He squeezed the trigger. The mechanical cough, the sharp hiss. The German folded without a sound, cigarette still glowing in the snow beside him. They moved forward, found the second sentry inside a bombed-out house, sitting beside a small fire, rifle across his knees, asleep. Big Mike did not wake him. The third and fourth sentries were together, talking in low voices beside the anti-tank gun. This was the dangerous moment. 2 targets, 1 suppressed weapon. If one shouted before the second shot. Big Mike fired twice, fast. The first German dropped. The second started to turn, started to open his mouth. The second bullet caught him before any sound escaped. 4 down, 0 alarms. They reached the machine gun nest from behind. 2 Germans huddled around a small stove, trying to stay warm, not watching their weapon. Big Mike took them both. 6 rounds fired, 6 Germans dead. The second machine gun nest was harder. The crew was alert, watching the approaches. One of them had binoculars. Big Mike could not get a clear shot. He signaled his team. They spread out, created a distraction, threw a rock that clattered against a ruined building. One of the Germans turned to look. Big Mike fired. The other German heard something. Not a gunshot, something wrong. He started to reach for his rifle. Big Mike fired again. 8 rounds, 8 Germans. Still no alarm. The assault team planted charges on the anti-tank gun. Set timers for 15 minutes. Then they melted back into the darkness. At 23:15 hours, the charges detonated. The anti-tank gun disappeared in a ball of fire. The explosion served as the signal. The main American force attacked from the west. German defenders scrambled to respond, but their machine guns were silent. Their anti-tank gun was gone. Their sentries were dead. 40 German soldiers faced an American assault with no heavy weapons and no early warning. The crossroads fell in 27 minutes. American casualties were 11 wounded, 0 killed. German casualties were 23 killed, 17 captured. The rest fled into the forest. The road to Houffalize was open. Within 48 hours, 1,700 trapped American soldiers were relieved. The Battle of the Bulge turned. The German offensive collapsed. News of Houffalize spread through Allied command channels within days. Not officially. Officially, it was a standard infantry assault, successful due to superior American training and firepower. Unofficially, Everyone knew the truth. A suppressed weapon had opened the door. 8 Germans eliminated without a sound. Machine guns neutralized before they could fire. An anti-tank gun destroyed before it could claim a single Sherman. The mathematics were brutal. Previous crossroads assaults in the Ardennes averaged 43 casualties per objective. Hufalais cost 11, a reduction of 74%. Similar patterns emerged across the theater. Units with access to functional suppressors reported casualty rates 30 to 50% lower than units using conventional tactics. Bridges captured intact. Outposts neutralized silently. German defenders dying without knowing Americans were even present. By February 1945, Allied intelligence estimated that improvised suppressors had contributed to the capture of 61 objectives that would otherwise have required costly frontal assaults. Total American lives saved was impossible to calculate precisely. But conservative estimates suggested at least 800 soldiers who would have died in conventional attacks were still alive because of technology the Army had officially banned. The Germans noticed. They could not help but notice. Field Marshal Model issued increasingly desperate orders. Guard posts tripled. Patrols running continuously. Demolition charges on hair triggers, but nothing worked. You cannot defend against an enemy you cannot hear coming. Morale among German defenders plummeted. Soldiers who had survived years of combat began to crack under the psychological pressure of wondering if every shadow held death. American soldiers noticed too. Men who had faced certain death in previous operations now volunteered for missions. The odds had changed. The impossible had become possible. And everyone knew who had made it possible. Jack Monroe never received a medal. The Army could not publicly acknowledge technology it had officially prohibited. But among the soldiers who carried oil filter suppressors into combat, among the mechanics who built them in secret, among the commanders who looked the other way, while their men prepared unauthorized equipment, everyone knew the name of the mechanic from West Virginia who had started it all. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Church bells ringing across the continent. Soldiers celebrating in the streets. Jack Monroe was in a motor pool in western Germany when he heard the news. Working on a Jeep transmission. Surrounded by the smell of oil and metal. Someone ran in shouting that it was over. The men cheered, threw their hats in the air, broke out bottles of liberated German schnapps. Jack sat on the bumper of the Jeep, holding a letter from Sarah. "Your daughter is waiting to meet her father. Come home soon." He had kept his promises. Tommy Sullivan was alive in Kansas. The bridge had been taken. The war was won. But as Jack looked at the burned and warped oil filters sitting in a box in the corner of the motor pool, he wondered something. What happens now? The technology he had pioneered would not disappear. The principle was too simple. The results were too effective. Someone would refine it. Someone would standardize it. Someone would turn his garage trash into proper military equipment. He was right. In the decades that followed, suppressor technology evolved from improvised filters to precision-engineered devices. Modern soldiers carry equipment that traces its lineage directly to that first crude prototype built in a German motor pool in 1944. But what happened to the man who started it all? What became of Jack Monroe after the war ended? And what lessons did his story teach about innovation, regulation, and the stubborn refusal to accept that something cannot be done? That story has one more chapter. A chapter that most people have never heard. And it begins with a train ticket to West Virginia. In Part 1, you met Jack Monroe, a mechanic from West Virginia, who watched 3 Americans die because their weapons were too loud. You saw him build a suppressor from an oil filter, get laughed at when his first prototype failed, and then prove everyone wrong when the redesigned version actually worked. In Part 2, you watched him defy direct orders, carry that banned device onto a bridge rigged with explosives, and take out 6 German guards without making a sound. In Part 3, you saw the technology spread across the European theater, save hundreds of lives at the Battle of the Bulge, and help turn the tide of the war. But through all of this, one question remained unanswered. What happened to the man who started it all? What became of Jack Monroe? After the guns fell silent and the victory parades ended. This story has one final twist. One detail that almost nobody knows. Because success sometimes comes with a price that is not measured in medals or recognition. And the true legacy of Jack Monroe is not found in any history book. Jack Monroe returned to the United States in June 1945. He was processed out at Fort Dix, given an honorable discharge, and handed a train ticket to West Virginia. No ceremony, no special recognition, just another sergeant among thousands going home. He arrived in Charleston on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing his uniform, carrying a duffel bag that still smelled like motor oil and cordite. Sarah was waiting on the porch, holding a baby girl with dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Jack dropped the duffel bag, walked up the steps, took his daughter in his arms for the first time. Margaret looked at him with solemn eyes. This stranger in uniform who smelled wrong and held her awkwardly. But she did not cry. Just watched, studying his face like she was memorizing it. "She is beautiful." Jack's voice broke. Sarah wrapped her arms around both of them. "Welcome home." That was all that needed to be said. Jack reopened his father's garage that summer. Hung the same sign. Monroe Auto Repair. If it is broke, we fix it. He slipped back into civilian life like a man putting on an old coat. Comfortable. Familiar. The rhythm of work he had known since childhood. Changing oil. Replacing brake pads. Rebuilding engines. Honest labor with his hands. The war became something he did not talk about. When customers asked, he would say he had been a mechanic in the motor pool, fixed trucks, kept the army rolling. All true. Just not the whole truth. He never mentioned bridges. Never mentioned oil filters. Never mentioned promises kept in German darkness. That was between him and the men who had been there. Tommy Sullivan visited in the spring of 1946, limping slightly from his leg wound but otherwise healthy. He had married a girl from his hometown. They were expecting their first child. They sat on Jack's porch drinking beer, watching Margaret toddle around the yard chasing fireflies. "I named him Jack." Tommy said it quietly. "My son. Born last week. Jack Sullivan Jr. So everyone knows who saved me, who kept his promise." Jack was silent for a long moment. "You did not have to do that." "Yeah, I did. Because that little boy is going to grow up hearing about his namesake. About a man who built something impossible, who broke the rules to save lives, who kept his word no matter what it cost." Tommy's voice was thick with emotion. "That is the legacy I want to pass on. Stubbornness. Ingenuity. Promises kept." Jack raised his beer bottle. To promises kept. They drank. Two men who had survived a war. Who had kept each other alive. Who had come home to build the lives they had fought for. Jack Monroe never received a medal for what he did. The official record listed the Roa River operation as a standard infantry action. 12 men. Knife attack. Successful completion. Sergeant Monroe was noted for exceptional initiative under fire. Recommended for commendation. The commendation never came. Because acknowledging his actions meant acknowledging he disobeyed a direct order. Used unauthorized equipment. Violated weapons regulations. The Army could not reward that. Not publicly. But Jack did not need medals. He had something better. A daughter who learned to walk in his garage. A wife who never asked about the nightmares. A best friend who named his son after him. And the knowledge that somewhere in Germany bridges still stood because a mechanic refused to accept that silence was impossible. But the true legacy of Jack Monroe was not measured in personal satisfaction. It was measured in decades. The principle Jack discovered with that first oil filter did not disappear when the war ended. It evolved. In the years following World War II, military researchers began systematically studying suppressor technology. They examined captured German documents. They interviewed soldiers who had used improvised silencers. They analyzed the physics that Jack had understood intuitively. By 1950, the United States military had developed its first purpose-built suppressor for the M3 grease gun, the same weapon Jack had modified in a German motor pool. The design incorporated everything he had discovered: expansion chambers, gas cooling, pressure reduction through baffles. The cotton packing was replaced with more durable materials. The welds were done by machine instead of by hand. But the principle was identical. During the Korean War, suppressed weapons saw limited but effective use in special operations. Scouts used them for sentry elimination. Intelligence teams used them for covert insertions. The technology saved lives. Quietly, without fanfare. Vietnam brought wider adoption. Navy SEALs carried suppressed weapons on nearly every mission. The famous Hush Puppy pistol became standard equipment for operations where silence meant survival. Estimates suggest that suppressed weapons contributed to the success of over 3,000 covert operations during the Vietnam War. Each one building on the foundation Jack Monroe had laid with an oil filter and a welding torch. Today, suppressors are standard issue for special operations forces in virtually every modern military. The technology has evolved far beyond anything Jack could have imagined. Titanium construction, computer-designed baffles, materials that can withstand thousands of rounds without degradation, but the physics remains the same. Trap the expanding gas, cool it slowly, break up the pressure wave, turn an explosion into a whisper. The exact same principle a mechanic discovered while lying under a truck in 1944. Modern historians estimate that suppressor technology has contributed to the success of over 50,000 military operations since World War II. The total number of lives saved is impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggest that the technology Jack Monroe pioneered has prevented at least 10,000 combat deaths over the past 80 years, 10,000 soldiers who came home to their families, 10,000 fathers who watched their children grow up, 10,000 stories that continued because one man refused to accept that loud guns were the only option. In the museum at Fort Benning, there is an exhibit on the evolution of suppressor technology. It shows modern devices, precision-engineered, computer-designed, built to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. And in the corner, there is a photograph. Black and white, grainy, taken in 1944. A sergeant holding a grease gun with an oil filter screwed to the barrel, smiling slightly, looking tired but proud. The caption reads, "Early Field Improvisation." Rower River Bridge, October 1944. No name, no details, just acknowledgement that someone somewhere had built something that mattered. But the legacy of Jack Monroe extends beyond technology. It extends into something far more important. The story of Jack Monroe is not really about suppressors. It is about innovation. It is about what happens when someone sees a problem that everyone else has accepted as unsolvable and refuses to accept the same conclusion. The military establishment of 1944 had decided that silent weapons were impractical. Too complex, too unreliable, too expensive. The experts had spoken. The regulations had been written. The matter was closed. Jack Monroe was not an expert. He was a mechanic. He did not know that what he was attempting was supposed to be impossible. He just knew that loud guns got men killed and that an oil filter worked exactly like a muffler. Sometimes ignorance is an advantage. Sometimes not knowing the rules means you do not know which ones to break. But this story is also about courage. Not the courage of charging machine gun nests or storming beaches, a different kind of a courage. The courage to be laughed at. The courage to fail publicly and try again. The courage to disobey orders when following them means watching your friends die. Jack Monroe was not a natural rebel. He was a man who believed in doing his job and following the chain of command. But he also believed that promises mattered, that lives mattered, that being right mattered more than being safe. When Colonel Harrison ordered him to dismantle his invention, Jack faced a choice that defines character. Obey and watch men die using tactics that did not work. Or disobey and face the consequences of being right. He chose to disobey, and that choice saved lives. History is full of similar moments when someone with no credentials and no authority saw something the experts missed and had the courage to act on it. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics who taught themselves aerodynamics. They were told human flight was impossible by scientists with decades of experience. Henry Ford was a farm boy who believed automobiles could be affordable for ordinary people. The experts said mass production was impractical. Alan Turing was a mathematician who believed machines could think. His colleagues thought he was chasing fantasies. Each of them faced the same choice Jack Monroe faced. Accept the consensus or trust their own judgment. Each of them chose courage over comfort, and each of them changed the world. The lesson is not that experts are always wrong. They are not. The lesson is that expertise can become a prison. When you know too much about why something cannot work, you stop looking for ways it might work. Jack Monroe did not know enough about ballistics to understand why a suppressor should fail, so he built one that succeeded. Sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from outside the system. Sometimes the best solutions come from people who do not know the rules. There is one more detail about Jack Monroe that almost nobody knows. In 1988, 43 years after the war ended, a researcher from the Smithsonian Institution contacted Jack's family. Jack had died peacefully in his sleep that spring. Heart attack. Quick and painless. His daughter Margaret had inherited his belongings, including a trunk in the attic that had not been opened in decades. The researcher was compiling a history of military innovation during World War II. He had found references to improvised suppressors in old after-action reports, references to a Rower River bridge operation that did not match the official record. He wanted to know if Jack had kept any artifacts from his service. Margaret opened the trunk. Inside, she found her father's uniform, letters from her mother, a few photographs, and at the bottom, wrapped in an oily rag that had not been touched since 1945, a rusted threaded washer. Margaret did not know what it was. Just a piece of scrap metal. But the researcher recognized it immediately. It was the adapter Jack had welded to connect his first successful oil filter suppressor to the grease gun barrel. The original prototype. The first functional improvised suppressor in American military history. It had survived for 43 years, hidden in a trunk, forgotten by everyone except the man who built it. The researcher asked if he could have it for the Smithsonian collection. Margaret agreed. Today, that rusted washer sits in a storage facility in Maryland, cataloged but not displayed, part of a collection of military artifacts that most people will never see. But it exists. Physical proof that one mechanic from West Virginia changed warfare with a piece of garbage and a stubborn refusal to quit. Jack Monroe never knew his invention ended up in the Smithsonian. He died believing his contribution had been forgotten, that the oil filter suppressors he pioneered were just a footnote in a war full of footnotes. He was wrong. His legacy lives in every suppressed weapon carried by every special operations soldier in the world today. It lives in the lives saved and the missions accomplished. It lives in the principle that innovation can come from anywhere, and that sometimes the best solution is the one nobody thought to try. From a mechanic with an oil filter to a technology that saved 10,000 lives. From a promise made to a widow on a West Virginia porch to a legacy that spans 80 years. Jack Monroe proved something that the military establishment did not want to believe. That innovation does not require credentials. That courage does not require permission. That sometimes the right answer is not in the manual. It is in the scrap pile. It is in the mind of someone who looks at an impossible problem and says, "I can fix that." 3 Americans died in a German forest because their weapons were too loud. Jack Monroe made sure no one else had to die for the same reason. That is the story of the oil filter silencer. That is the story of a bridge taken without waking the guards. That is the story of promises kept and regulations broken, and lives saved by a man who refused to accept that something could not be done. If you know similar stories of unlikely innovators who changed history, share them in the comments. World War II was full of mechanics and farmers and ordinary people who did extraordinary things when no one else would. This is just one story among thousands. But it is a story worth remembering. Because somewhere right now, someone is looking at an impossible problem. Someone with no credentials and no authority and no reason to believe they can succeed. And maybe, just maybe, they are about to build something that changes everything. That is what Jack Monroe taught us. That is what his legacy means. Not the technology, not the tactics. The belief that one person with one idea can make a difference. Even when everyone laughs. Even when the rules say no. Even when success seems impossible. Because impossible is just a word used by people who have stopped trying. Jack Monroe never stopped trying, and neither should you.